everyone. Welcome to another segment of Mental Health Moments. My name is Linda Golick. I'm the Health and Wellbeing Consultant here at Bellin Health, and so excited to have all of you with us today, taking some time out to really focus on our mental health. So, extra special treat today. I have two amazing therapists with us today. As always, we have Charles Latour, who is our regular main speaker on these segments. How are you doing, Charles?
I'm doing good. How are you doing, Linda?
Great.
Good.
And also today, who has been special with us before, and we're always so glad to have her back, is Mary Lou Conard. And Mary Lou is the director of outpatient care over at our Bellin Psychiatric Center. So welcome, Mary Lou.
Thanks, Linda. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me back.
You bet. Always our pleasure. So this month, we really wanted to spend a little time, and this was on the invitation, and I hope all of you find an interest in this as much as I have more recently. So I was really struck by a story that came through in February, and I'm sure a lot of you heard about it too, how Miss USA 2019 had died by suicide. And what a tragedy it is when anyone dies of suicide. I then came across an article from a friend of hers, which was actually Miss North Dakota, Samantha Redding, and she was talking about how much pressure there is with social media and the need to look perfect and be perfect. And she was quoted as saying, when people think that your Instagram feed or your Facebook post are your real life, then it can be misleading. And that really made me think about the effect that social media has on a lot of us. And when I brought this up to Charles, Charles had brought up the idea of, well, let's talk about the movie, The Social Dilemma. So for those of you that haven't seen the movie, we're going to tell you a little bit about it, and then, of course, you can always look it up. It's on Netflix. But we're going to tell you a little bit more about what we learned from that movie and maybe how it applies to all of us today, and in particularly how a lot of this is affecting our kids and what we can do about it to help the kids in our lives. So, Charles, I want to start with you. When you came across the movie, The Social Dilemma, what were your thoughts on it? What really stood out to you about that movie?
Well, yeah, a couple different things, a lot of things actually, but first was just, it wasn't what I thought it was. I thought I was watching like a movie, and instead this was more like a documentary, prepping for one of the leading IT people prepping for a TED Talk that was so viral. I watched that too. But I wound up watching this documentary that had like a mini movie within it of a family acting out the dynamics that were taking place in the documentary. I really found it fascinating. I was like, wow, this is really interesting. Not what I thought, but very interesting. But it really led me to find out that there is so much going on in these IT platforms, these social media platforms, and a lot of what I thought from what I've seen clinically, but it opened my eyes even more to all that is really actually happening in these things. And I'll say just a couple other things about it. It brought up that they were looking at impact of consequences of social media from a couple different lenses. Area of consequences included the misinformation that becomes prevailing out there because of social media, political polarization, invasion or personal privacy risks. And the one that I think we'll get to focus most on today, and it was most relevant to me, was the whole element of mental health, and how social media was started with the intention of this incredibly greater good approach. But it over time has gone to not so great and maybe even destructive, to the point that by the end of the movie, there were some very dire warnings of potential consequences that maybe we'll talk about a little bit later. But as far as a brief overview, that's some of what I would share. Mary Lou, curious for you too, what your immediate takeaways and responses to the movie were before we get into some of the mental health issues with it.
Sure, absolutely. And I'd be curious from the group joining us on the call, just go ahead and chat in. How many of you have seen the movie, The Social Dilemma? I'd be curious just to know. I've seen it twice now, watched it once, I think, when it first came out, and then Charles assigned me the assignment to watch it again before this mental health moment. And I watched it, you know, kind of through a therapist's eyes and through a mom's eyes, both times when I watched it. But would echo some of what Charles just talked about. I guess I was surprised by the technical science behind social media. I mean, I watched it again from the perspective of how do I use social media? What do I worry about when my kids use social media? My patients that I worked with at the time use social media, but I was very surprised by the technical science behind the algorithms and you know, how information is pushed out to the consumer, the user of social media, and really the impact that has in kind of all those areas that Charles mentioned. That was fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's a very interesting show to watch, and I really would recommend it just from an educational standpoint to really understand what drives social media and why things end up in front of us the way they do. And the documentary was so well done because it would put these little scenarios within the movie. So the one that really stood out to me was the mom made everyone put their cell phones in one of those boxes. It was locked down, so they couldn't have their phones during dinner. And everybody is in like a little bit of a panic attack. And then she makes a deal with her one son because his phone ends up with a broken screen. The mom makes a deal with her son saying, if you stay away from your phone for a week, I will buy you a new screen. And he says, okay. So then they show this illustration of these data people in the background saying, hey, this guy hasn't checked his phone in a really long time. What else can we put out there to make sure that he's clicking on his phone? Because the more that we're on our phones, the more potential there is for these companies to make money by the ads we see, by the products that we buy. So they're trying to draw us in. They're trying to get reactions from us. So in this movie, they show what they did was they then gave this young teenager a notification that his ex-girlfriend was in a relationship with somebody else, and then that made him pick up the phone. So it just kind of illustrates how much strategy there is and marketing there is behind what ends up in front of you. And I agree, Chris, that they're trying to manipulate us because the more they can, the more they get out of us. Charles, would you agree?
Well, yeah, in fact, that is really the entire component. That is, if there's a disturbing element to it, and believe me, there's many, for anybody who has seen it, the idea is what they're after more than anything else is you and your time. The more you are on it and the things that get you on it that so they want to do two things. One, take your time. They don't make money if you're not on these platforms, right? The second one is to slowly, subtly, sometimes even quickly change your behavior. Those are the two things that they are doing because in this age of surveillance capitalism, everything is about knowing you. The better they know you, the better they have your data. That's whoever knows you best and can predict what behavior changes you will do and make. Those are the platforms that make the most money and have made these internet companies the richest companies in the history of planet Earth, the history of civilization. So it's all about knowing you. They know if you're depressed, they know if you're anxious, they know if you're worried, they know what you want to buy, sometimes before you know if you want to buy it. They know if you're married, they know if you're getting a divorce, they know if you're introverted, they know if you're extroverted. It's all about getting that information enough to know you and hopefully manipulate you and change. So Yeah, if that isn't disturbing, I mean, I don't know what is. Secondly, it's in many respects targeted at anybody but kids. I mean, there's one, Tristan Harris in the movie says, I don't know one parent. I've never met one parent who, if you said to them, I want my kid to be manipulated, easily known, information shared, and changing and isolating for the sake of social media, what parent is going to say, oh, yeah, that's what I want too? You know, so that doesn't happen, but that is what is happening, especially when they become more isolated and tech addicted, which is one of the actual elements of the process. So more to come on that, but to answer your question, absolutely, at the core of it, that's one of the most disturbing elements of it altogether.
What are your thoughts on that, Mary Lou?
I would agree. I mean, it is manipulation. It's behavior change science, really, is what it comes down to. And you know, if you have an opportunity to watch the movie, I would recommend it. It is very interesting. It's fascinating. It's disturbing. I watched it with my now 23-year-old daughter second time around, and I'll share a little bit about some of that feedback from her. But and we watched it totally through a different lens from when she was, 17 to 23 now. It was interesting to listen to the, former CEOs and software engineers and the folks that worked at the Facebooks and Instagrams. And I couldn't help but think how brave it was for them to come forward with the information that they did in this movie, because they were, and you could see in some of them, they were nervous. They were nervous about creating the docudrama. They were anxious about the fallout and what may come of that. Because there is a lot of money in the social media machines that are out there, and huge risk that they all took to kind of out social media through this particular film.
Absolutely. And one of the things that really struck me more recently, even before we decided that this was going to be a topic, I was talking to a friend of mine, and a lot of my friends have teenagers at this point, and we were talking about how when we were teenagers, we didn't have the social media in front of us showing us every party that we were missing, everything that we weren't invited to, or that so-and-so was going to Disneyland and we weren't, or all these things. And I know, Charles, you and I had talked about the fact that we really think that social media has contributed to the increase of anxiety and depression in some of our younger teens, because you had shared a statistic that you used to never see it before like age 14, and now we're seeing it younger and younger.
Sure. Yeah. So when you think about this whole concept of Tim Kendall, who was the person, and I really appreciated his transparency and honesty. He was the person who was in charge of monitoring social media, particularly for Facebook. And he talked about the process of even being, he used the term behind the curtain. I knew what all of this was about, and I still couldn't overcome it myself. And so this intermittent positive reinforcement they use is the triggering mechanism. And he used the quote, their whole effort is how much time can we get from you to spend, and how much of your life are you willing to give us? That's what they're trying to do. And the most susceptible to that, even though I'm saying we're all susceptible, but teenagers in particular, because in their way of going about what their life is all about is being accepted. And when I was growing up, older than you, Linda, and Mary Lou, but to me, it's like they talk about this notion of Tristan Harris uses the term your tribe, the people around you, who's in your class, your friends, maybe teammates if you play sports, and you want them to like you, right? Okay, that's great. Now we have this where you may be 10,000 people that you're communicating with, hoping that they like you. And we get this binary like or dislike, 2 thumbs up or thumbs down, hearts or dislikes. So we have this binary world where we're liked or disliked. And when you're an adult, you can maybe have perspective with that. So it's like, okay, maybe not everybody liked me, but I'm being me who I am, and hopefully that's good enough for everybody. And I have to be good enough with that. But now we have this curated life that I call it the Kardashian life, where I have to post everything that I did, how great it was. I had the greatest vacation. Mine was better than yours. And then when we weren't either part of this great party that everybody loved, I wasn't invited, or I didn't get the greatest trip, or I post something and someone doesn't like it, and I'm 12 years old, right? What does that feel like? So we have this explosion, and one of the leading psychologists on the planet out of NYU came up with these statistics, and I'll read them for you, that since 2011, which obviously just happens to coincide with the rise of social media, there's been a 62% increase in teen anxiety and depression, up 189% for preteens. 189% increase. That's more than tripling. More disturbing, if that's not bad enough, is the same pattern for suicide. Older teens, 70% increase since 2010 to now, since the first decade of the 2000s. And then younger preteens up 151%. And this was basically almost, and where you're talking earlier, is this idea that this category almost didn't even exist of early or preteen suicides, but now they're getting this information, these things said about them, all of these dislikes. And I'm going to tell you the most disturbing one that I have found. And it's this concept of KISS, KYS. And before I tell you what it is, does anybody know what that is? Anybody on the call familiar with that acronym KYS? Okay, so when I have kids in my office and they have told me that the reason they're so depressed, that they're so worried, they're so anxious, and that they're suicidal is either a friend, but it's usually a friend on social media, told them to go KISS. And KISS is go kill yourself. And that is a message that people are getting on these platforms. And if a dislike or a thumbs down or not getting a heart isn't enough to fuel depression and anxiety, that kind of comment, unbelievably earth-shattering to a young teen, or actually any teenage life. So it's really unbelievable what is actually happening on these platforms. So there's more I want to say, but Mary Lou, I'm curious, anything that you have found or seen in your experiences?
Sure, I've heard more and more and have seen more often kind of a newly identified anxiety disorder out there, social media anxiety disorder. I think the layperson would know it as FOMO, fear of missing out, right? This kind of almost obsessive desire to be on social media, check social media, stopping in the middle of a conversation to pick up their phone and see what that notification was that just came through, not being able to cut back on time that they spend on social media, and the amount of anxiety that comes with that kind of dichotomy of thumbs up, thumbs down world that they live in, and that creating an incredible amount of anxiety for, we say teens, preteens, even adults who spend a significant amount of time on social media and kind of tie their relationships and their social outlets to what they get, give and receive from social media. So I found that interesting, that the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that mental health therapists and psychiatrists use to make diagnoses, that it doesn't change very often. But this is a newly kind of emerging anxiety disorder that's being talked about out there, social media anxiety disorder. And it's interesting and unfortunately real.
Yeah, I want to say one other thing. I love that, Mary Lou. There's one other that is really interesting, and it's called Snapchat dysphoria. That, the whole Snapchat thing and all of these things, and the body image issues that come with these platforms as well, the social isolation that we get so caught up in this rather than the rest of life. One other interesting term out there is Fobbing, which is snubbing your partner by participating more on your phone than with them. So that's a thing out there. It's decreased family time, it's increased anxiety and depression, and it's just made people all the way around periodically more uncomfortable to the point of depression or anxiety, and as we mentioned, even suicidal. There's one thing I feel like I have to say right now, Mary Lou and I talked about this too, is what we don't want this to turn into is like a Siskel and Ebert 2 thumbs up or 2 thumbs down either on this, because we're not saying, any about the movie as interesting as it was. This isn't an attack or a knock on social media, because it's done so many great things. It's brought high school people together, reunions together, cancer survivors together, survivors of cancer together, all these different things. There's so many unbelievably great things. So I want to really blend that with this. It's not a critique, it's just highlighting some of the areas of consequence. So amazing, great things have been done through social media.
Yeah, I really agree with you there, Charles, because I know that I have kind of this love-hate relationship with social media. The parts I love are seeing that my cousin's kids are playing sports and connecting with people that maybe I've lost touch with, and some of those inspirational places I can go to really start the day on with a happy quote and some of those types of things. And so for that, I really love social media. It's a great way to connect. But then what I've noticed is that it can suck up a lot of my time, and it can make me feel kind of yucky. So Charles and I had a conversation where I just really realized every morning I'm waking up that the first thing I do is I start the coffee, I turn on my phone, and I start scrolling. And how quickly we can waste so much time, and you come off of that, and you really don't feel better starting the day. So I had made a deal with Charles that I was going to stop doing that in the morning, and I was going to start reading instead first thing in the morning. And I will say, I'm of an age where, my eyes aren't great in the morning, and I kind of need to wake up a little bit. But Charles, I have been doing that even just for the last 8 days. I'm already through a book and a half, and I am
great.
And you know what's really great is the last couple of mornings I wake up and I think, oh, I'm really excited to get up and read my book for a little while before I have to get my day going. So just for my own personal reflection, I just felt like I needed to reset that pattern for myself. I felt like I was taking in a little too much social media. So even if it isn't really detrimental for you, you may just want to evaluate. How does it make you feel? What kind of an impact does it have on you? Is it adding something good to your day, or is it adding something not so good to your day? And I think all of us can ask ourselves those questions.
Yeah, Mary Lou, do you have I know something similar in your effort to disengage periodically?
Yeah, I shared with Charles after I watched The Social Dilemma the second time. I decided that I was going to get off of Instagram. I don't use a whole lot of social media. I'm old. I use Facebook. That's what a lot of old people use. But Instagram, I got on because my kids were on it and wanted to stay connected with them. I decided that after watching The Social Dilemma, I wanted to just get rid of my Instagram account, and I couldn't. I went to disable my account. It asked me 3 or 4 questions, and then it asked me for my password. Well, I didn't remember my password. So I clicked reset my password, It had me put my email in so it could send me a new link to reset my password. I never got the email to reset my password. I could not get off of social media. I couldn't discontinue it.
I've heard that from other people who've tried to disable their accounts, but they make it difficult for you. So Jody had actually posted that she gave up Facebook for Lent, and it's very liberating. So good job, Jody. That's awesome.
Great, Jody.
So really good stuff. The other thing that I thought was interesting about that movie was they talked about like why it's addictive, like what it does in your brain, and it gives your brain these surges of dopamine, and that's why it's so addictive, and that's why it's hard to put down, and that's why we're looking for the affirmations with the comments and the likes and all those types of things. For both of you, can you explain that a little bit more, like what's going on, and how do we not get sucked into that?
It's part of the intermittent positive reinforcement. It's hard not to get sucked into it. It's like a natural part of how we respond. We are more interested in waiting, believe it or not, waiting for something than what we actually get. The wait is greater than the reward. That's why people will say the hunt is greater than the catch, is that we're a society who, and that is why when we send something, we see those ellipses, those three little things as like, oh, what's going to hit? What's going to hit? What am I going to get? And as time goes on, when we have those dopamine detox times where we're not getting it, we are just waiting and looking for the next opportunity to get something. And that's why it is. You never know if you're going to get it or when you're going to get it. And that makes it more appealing. It's the same physiological reaction to playing a slot machine as being on this, is you never know when you're going to get it, and the waiting for it and the idea that maybe you will, maybe you won't, is as enticing as anything else. So this is almost the same physiology, and whoever used the idea of manipulation, that's exactly what it is. It's like being in an arcade full of slot machines that you're being manipulated by to stay there and not leave it. And that's what it's all about.
Yeah, I would agree. And that's where that sense of, or we hear about being kind of addicted to social media comes from. It very much is that, dopamine is that natural happy chemical that we get when we receive those positives. Dopamine flares in our body when we get a hug or a kiss, or we feel loved. When we get the thumbs up and the like, we have that, kind of that happiness chemical that comes, right, exactly, as Charles is saying. And when it's not there, we enter that feeling of deficit, and it is a bit of addiction. Gambling is a good analogy to that we continue to go back knowing that I'm going to hit at some point. I'm going to get that hit at some point. I'm going to get the thumbs up. I'm going to get the like, and it keeps us coming back for that hit.
Even those likes in the meantime do it. But Mary Lou really touched on something really important that I want to come back to. In the movie, one of the this is a Stanford star, by the way, if any of you have seen it, Anna Lemke. Unbelievable addiction specialist, wonderful researcher, professor, definitely a Stanford star. One of the interesting parts of the movie was they were interviewing her, but they're also interviewing her kids. She has a son and daughter, and they were comparing their use of time on social media. And what was funny is the son was like trying to minimize his use, and the daughter thought hers was less than his. So then they compared numbers, and then his were significantly higher than he thought, but they were less than she thought. She's like, oh, I guess I'm using it more than you. So here's this addiction specialist with her kids having this same addictive quality, which tells us that none of us are above or immune to this type of experience. It's just what it is. But the other thing that I want to highlight with that, and why this is in some ways so disturbing, is Tristan Harris made this comment, which was never before in our history of humanity have somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 or 50 people within several companies dictated so much of what happens in the lives of as many as 2 to 3 million people. And that's what it's all about. It's like absolutely amazing that this is what happens.
Absolutely. So, Mary Lou, I know one of the things that we wanted to talk about was also, your experience with your children, and obviously, we can't keep our kids from social media, and we can't say, no, I'm taking away your phone for 2 weeks. I mean, that would cause all sorts of other problems, I'm sure. As I've seen with my friends that have teenagers, I don't think you want to go there. So how do you manage that? Where's the happy medium to make sure that our kids are protected, but also make sure that they are a part of things and connecting with their friends and those types of things?
Yeah, those are great questions, and there has got to be a happy medium, right? And it's different for every family. It's different for every kid and their ability to manage socially what's going on in their lives. We talked about some of it already. Some of it really starts with us as adults and being sure that we model the right kind of use of social media. We take breaks from social media, we put the phone aside at dinner time, that we set those expectations, and we just really teach appropriate use of social media and model that for our kids, regardless of what age our kids are. And set our own limits for ourselves on how we utilize social media, and then set those expectations for our kids. Keeping tabs on social media and what your kids are on, talking to them about how they feel about what they may have seen on social media or what they may have heard from a friend on social media, that type of thing. Monitoring their messages. I would assume that most of us on this call, if we've got kids, we pay for our kids' cell phones and media. So that was always one of my approaches with my kids is, look, I pay for your phone. I pay for the internet access in this house. So I get to know what's happening with it as well. I used to, when my kids were much younger, require that they put the phone in the kitchen at the end of the night so they could have appropriate wind down time at the end of the day. I didn't want them to have their phones or their personal devices in their bedrooms about an hour before their bedtime. I did that for two reasons, because I wanted them to have a good restful night's sleep. I didn't want them to be interrupted with notifications in the middle of the night or be scrolling through their phone under their covers at midnight. But I also wanted their phone to be charged so I could get a hold of them when I needed to get a hold of them the next day, after practice or, after school or whatever, to be able to keep tabs on them in that way. So really just enforcing some guidelines and modeling for our kids appropriate use of social media is really kind of at the core of that.
Yeah, that's one of the things I felt so great about Mary Lou being on this is not only we did something a couple weeks ago and Mary Lou approached it from the mom standpoint. So not only is she a knowledgeable clinician, but when her mother intuition is going on, it's equally as strong and a strength of her. So I'm so glad to hear that. I wanted to chime in on that. And I have a good friend who let her daughter for the first time on social media. This is a runner, a really great kid, student athlete at an early age, and just really natural, fun loving. And all of a sudden got like this really mean attitude with her family, and snuck some money to buy makeup and kind of caked herself up in makeup, 11 years old. And the mom saw her and was like, what are you doing? And she said, well, I with my new phone, I decided to join this, and people told me I look too young and athletic, and to look more mature, I should put makeup on if I wanted to be pretty rather than athletic. And it created this dichotomy for her of, I thought I was pretty, I thought I was enough. And to me, this whole thing, what I have found most disturbing is the identity that we have, the self-concept that we have, the self-worth that we have, the self-esteem we have, is now being dictated to these 10, 11, 12, 13-year-olds by people who they have never even met. They wouldn't know them if they walked in the door, but they're telling them what they're worth and what they should look like and what they should feel like. And I think we have to be able to do some of what Mary Lou was describing to monitor some of that, so these kids aren't being bombarded with feedback about them and told what they're about by people who don't even know them. They don't know their personality. They don't know the type of person they are, which is really who we are on the inside, is what they don't get to see. So that to me is another disturbing element of it. So I want to chime in also, if I may, one other thing around what can be done, for kids, because oftentimes parents will tell me, well, I'm just going to take their phone away from them. And okay, that's great. And that is an option. But what we know, and there are times for that, but what we know, and some of the leading authorities on this, one of them, Jaron Lanier, uses this concept of, to be able to have this idea that we need to learn what we learned from the tobacco companies to deal with this, which was, if we just take it away and say you can't have it, it only reinforces the desire to have it. But so when cigarettes and the idea of keeping kids away from cigarette is bad for you, you can't have it, and we're not letting you, it made kids even more interested in what they can't have, right? But when they were informed about how they're being manipulated, addicted at the earliest ages by Joe Camel ads and so forth, that's when teenagers are like, look, if you tell me I can't have it, I want it. But when you tell me I'm being manipulated by it and I'm understanding that and I'm getting it, I don't want that. That's when the decrease happened. And that's what they're saying has to happen with this. The awareness of the manipulation and not falling for that is what's going to help, rather than just telling kids they can't do this or be on it. So that's what's going to help the mental health.
And just being able to have those conversations, right? I mean, I think there's so much value in talking to your kids, talking to your nieces and nephews, talking to the younger people in your life, especially at those tender ages where they're figuring it out, right? They don't know everything and where everything comes from, and it's important to ask them, what are you seeing? What are you hearing? Who are you talking to? How does that feel for you? All those things, just to really remain in touch. And Mary Lou, I loved your comment about having the kids put their phone away so that they could, get a good night's sleep. I mean, I think that's another thing. That's a whole other element to having these digital devices in our hands all the time. It potentially really impacts our health and well-being, because we're doing that rather than maybe doing the things that our body really needs. Someone else had commented on how they had given up Facebook and now they have more time to work out. So, I mean, we really have to evaluate how we're using our time, and maybe if we can lessen one thing, we can increase the other things that our body really needs. I also wanted to touch a little bit on, Charles, you and I had talked about this idea of kind of the keeping up with the Joneses and the things that we're exposed to because of our devices and social media, and we're seeing what people are doing with their homes or what vacations they're going on, and how that makes people feel. And you had a great acronym that you had mentioned, the SAM acronym. Did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. It's not a real one, by the way. I totally made this up. It's based off the notion that what you begin to monitor, you begin to modify. And it sounds like I could never read the comments that come up, but I love when you read them off, Linda, because some of what you and Mary Lou have both talked about in some of the other comments is, once you have this awareness, and the beautiful thing you were just saying about talking with your children, to be able to have the ability to understand this whole notion of manipulation is a very serious and in-depth conversation with your kids, a very caring conversation, and to be able to go there, which once that is in place, you now have what I call self-awareness. Self-awareness that leads to careful monitoring, that leads to modification. If we're not aware of something, we can't even monitor it. And if we're not going to monitor it, we're not going to modify it. So SAM is about self-awareness, monitoring, and modification. And exactly what you both described in your effort to, in Jody's comment as well, and some of the other ones, giving it up is once you have the self-awareness of what is happening and what I want to do, then you are armed with enough information to monitor and modify, and then you have a fighting chance. Otherwise, without that awareness, this just happens to you. We've already talked about the nature of intermittent positive reinforcement. This gives you a fighting chance to deal with what is coming at you all the time on social media, and it equips you to be in charge of what's going to be in front of you and how often you're going to be in front of the screen. If we don't have that, we don't have a chance.
So I'll kick in on a mom comment there, because as adults, we struggle with self-awareness, and our kids whose brains aren't even, half developed as ours, struggle that much more. So it does behoove us as parents, guardians, caregivers, aunts, uncles, grandparents, to really help our kids become self-aware. And that's challenging to do sometimes. It does go to what we were talking about before, knowing what your kids are up to, knowing what they're into, knowing what's coming at them. And for my own children, and even when I was working with children in direct service for mental health care, I would often reflect to a child, boy, I think I might feel XYZ if I heard that. And I would give them that feeling or talk through what those potential feelings might be in an effort to help my kids open up, help them name maybe what that feeling is, because sometimes kids, they feel the feel, but they don't know what it's called or how to express what that feeling is. So helping our kids be self-aware can mean kind of giving them the words or helping them identify what those emotions or what those feelings may be, so they can then become more self-aware, monitor, and modify.
I love that, Mary Lou. I want to chime in one other thing with it, and helping parents of kids that I see be able to do that. The biggest distinguishing factor that this creates, this self-awareness process to monitor and modify, is that if we do that, this is a conversation that's for them. If it's taking away what they're using, their device, they're doing something to them. And when kids have this thing of, she did this to me, he did that to me, they won't let me do this, they don't, that is something done to them. The conversation that Mary Lou described is they feel it is being done for them, and they're much likely to be on board with it when it's a for them rather than a feeling that it's to them. And that distinction is critical in this.
Absolutely. So much great information on helping our kids and helping all of us, manage all of this media that comes at us in all these different directions. So thank you to both of you. If you have questions for Charles or Mary Lou, please type those in. I did have one question that came in that I wanted to ask you two about, and I don't know, this might involve a little bit more in-depth conversation, but someone is wondering, when is the appropriate age to explain to your child what suicide means? I ask because we're watching American Idol, and they were talking about a suicide story, and her 8-year-old asked what suicide meant. So do either of you have any comments on when you think that's an appropriate age to have that conversation?
Yeah, Mary Lou, you want to go first, or you want me to?
No, I'll go ahead. I don't know that there's an appropriate age. Again, it's different for each kid and kind of where their emotional state is. 8 is young, but we know even through this conversation, younger and younger kids are being exposed to more and more of what we as adults don't really ever want our children to have to be exposed to. In my conversations with children that I've worked with, I've usually flipped the question on them. What do you think suicide is? What do you think they're talking about? And allow the child to kind of guide you through the conversation, and obviously making that very age appropriate. An 8-year-old's not going to truly understand what somebody making a decision because they feel so bad and sad and want to, no longer be here. They're not going to understand that. But flipping the question a bit on them and saying, well, that's a really great question. What do you think suicide is? What do you think they're talking about? Can really open the conversation at an age appropriate level. And kids will guide you through that. They'll guide you by continuing the conversation, and they'll guide you then by going, okay, I'm going to go out and play now. And the conversation's done all of a sudden, and they've gotten what they've needed in that moment. And they're good to go. So I often will kind of flip the script on them and say, that's a really great, and not necessarily feel the pressure to have the right answer, but, can we navigate together? What do you think that means?
Thank you so much for that, Mary Lou. I think that's a great place to start, because you're right, kids can be so different. Different ages, what they've been exposed to, what they may think it is. So thank you so much for explaining that. I don't see any other questions. I just want to make note that as we wrap up, we are going to be continuing this conversation in the month of April. So in April, we're going to have another special guest. We're going to have a young lady that has really used her position and her platform to reach out to other teenagers and to help them build self-esteem and have a platform to have a voice. So you won't want to miss April's segment. But as we wrap up today, Charles and Mary Lou, any closing comments today? Any thoughts you want to leave us with today?
I have a bunch of them. I love Mary Lou's answer to that, and I wanted to chime in on the suicide, finding what it means to them. I was working in a treatment facility at one time, and the teenagers would ask for feedback of what they thought they needed to improve on from the other teenagers there. And one teenager once said, I think you're great, you're doing awesome. I'd love for you to go for level 4 because I think you're doing so great. The only thing I think you really need to work on is your self-esteem. And her answer was, oh my gosh, I know I've been trying to get rid of that for the last 3 weeks. So, and everybody chuckled, is like, well, that's not really what I meant. But we got to find out what they think they're even asking, and ask the question first, what it means. And there's some great research. Another Stanford guy, his name is Andrew Huberman. He has a great podcast called the Andrew Huberman Lab. And he talks about the newest researches, which every age that we knew of, like, for example, 13 starts adolescence, it's earlier. So whatever we thought was early or late, that's been changed biologically by about 2 to 3 years. So I hope that helps anybody in navigating through that as well. But one last thing on the social dilemma, I just want to say this, that there's disturbing information on it. Not everybody may like it, but hopefully as we look at it, we think at least one thing, that we could all do better. And there's some dire predictions. I certainly hope they don't come to fruition, but I hope we could do better. And that the main thing we wanted this to be is an opportunity to increase awareness so that we're all navigating our way through the social platforms we're on as effectively as possible for us, but even more sometimes how we model that for our children. So more to come as we go to round 2 on this one in April.
Mary Lou, any other parting thoughts from you today?
I guess my hope out of this conversation would be that everybody on the call would take this conversation home, and tonight at the dinner table, put your phone aside, put your device aside, and just see what your family has to say about it. Share with them what you experienced in this conversation, and have that conversation with your family, with those around you.
Love that, Mary Lou. Thank you so much. Because absolutely, at Bellin Health, I mean, we want to treat the whole person. And we know that mental health is such a big part of that. And we know that growing relationships is a part of that. So that's a great recommendation, to take this conversation and have it with your family, have it with your friends, hear what other people are doing and what's working for them. So thank you to the both of you for being with us today. We're so blessed to have both of you giving us so much great information on this call today. And again, we're going to continue this conversation in April, so you'll make sure to want to join us then. Until then, have a great rest of the day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.